Last month, I watched a grape variety get executed in public. And this is what the executioner had to say. If it weren't so easy to pronounce and so easy for brand owners to make money out of it, we probably wouldn't have planted the damn thing in the first place. Now, the grape that he was talking about is Merlot. That is the most planted grape in all of France. One vine in every 7. And it has just been written off out loud in a Cape Town conference room by judges from the 2026 Trophy Wine Show. So today, I'm going to try and restore its honor. And I'm going to be using one cloud-smothered apple valley called Elgin and 2 bottles of Almenkerk Merlot, 9 vintages apart, that both flatly refuse to read their own obituaries. Hello, and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine video where we review curious wines for curious minds. Now, the quote from that judge was not just a once-off, it was the closing argument. The whole thing had a little earlier unfolded like a car crash viewed through one of those Russian dashboard cams, or perhaps more entertainingly, like watching Machine Gun Kelly get lyrically murdered by a prepubescent teen at a school talent show. So what had happened is that there had been 25 South African Merlots that went into the Trophy Wine Show competition, and here is what came out. Across those 25 wines, the common theme was bitter and tannic. And then the line that this entire video hangs on emerged when the great Oz Clarke stated, Merlot is a cool climate grape in a hot world. In Bulgaria, in parts of Italy, they're pulling Merlot out. They are not even replanting Merlot in parts of Saint-Emilion. Now let's just let that sink in for a second, because I've made an entire video about how popular Merlot once was. Merlot was once so popular that the French agricultural department had to ban all new plantings of Merlot because it threatened to unbalance the national vineyard. But according to the Trophy Wine Show judges, that has less to do with how the wine tastes and more to do with the fact that you can order it in a restaurant without fluffing the pronunciation. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then perhaps try ordering Hush Levelou after your 3rd glass and you'll get the idea. Now, normally, when someone you know gets executed, as I'm sure we've experienced, you send flowers and bake a casserole for the bereaved. But I think today I've done something better. I went looking for the one address in South Africa where Merlot is not just svelte and lithe and alive, but it's aging better than most of us. And that address is nowhere in Stellenbosch, it's not in Paarl, it is in fact a bowl on top of a mountain better known for growing apples. Now, the wine is the Almenkerk Merlot 2023, and I'll be later tasting it next to the exact same wine from 2014. And let me just state up front that in South Africa, the 2014 vintage is certainly not remembered with much fondness. So we have a 12-year-old bottle from a vintage that the entire country wrote off, and that comparison gave up more than a few surprises. Amidst the other comments about Merlot, one of the trophy judges said that in South Africa, we get sugar ripeness long before phenolic ripeness. Now, some of you will nod sagely along with that, but others will quite reasonably say, hang on, I don't even know what phenolic ripeness is. Surely something is either ripe or it's not. Well, as it turns out, when you bite into a banana and decide whether it is ripe, you're not assessing one thing, you're assessing 2 completely separate things at the same time. So I drew you a graph to tease these 2 things apart. And if we continue with our example of the lowly banana, think of a time when you last hacked off the slightly green skin of a banana and bit into the awaiting flesh. And you noticed 2 things almost immediately. First of all, a powdery discomfort across your teeth and cheeks, like the banana was carrying a child born of a night of passion between musty cotton wool and a roll of sandpaper. And secondly, you notice a distinct lack of sweetness. And so you cry, oh no, too soon, 'tis not ripe. And you're correct, albeit a little melodramatic. But you're not just correct on 1 count, but on 2. The lack of sweetness is because the fruit didn't have enough time to accumulate sugar. That is sugar ripeness. And then the traumatic, dry cotton wool discomfort across your teeth is a completely separate failure. That is a lack of phenolic ripeness. And those 2 processes don't necessarily run at the same speed. So now leave the banana behind and we'll move on to the noble grape, perhaps slightly more relevant for today's video. In grapes, phenolic ripeness is the ripening of the skins, the seeds, and the stems. And those are the parts that give a red wine its structure and its tannin. And then sugar ripeness is simply the accumulation of sugar, which you need either to taste delicious at an al fresco brunch, or to make alcohol in a fermentation vat. Now, to understand those two things and how they end up in your glass, it helps to think about the tortoise and the hare, because both processes are running at the same time. They're just not synchronized. So phenolic ripeness for today's tale is the tortoise, and it trundles along at its own stubborn schedule and will not be hurried. Sugar ripening is the hare, and the hare is a rather fragile little beastie, affected ever so by the oppressive heat. So in a hot wine region, the hare never stops for a nap. It absolutely trashes the tortoise. So your sugar hits harvest-ready levels while the skins and seeds still taste like a green banana, which leaves a vigneron or grape farmer with two bad options, really. Pick now and you get thin, green, bitter, tannic wines with high alcohol potential, or wait for the tortoise to finish, tortoise being phenols, and then the fruit goes raisiny and the wine is sickly, jammy, and flabby. A little bit like Chris Farley near the end, I suppose. Bless him. Anyway, that is, in one banana or bunch of grapes, exactly what the judges were describing across the 25 South African Merlots that they tasted. But in a cool region, or one with properly cold nights, the hare keeps stopping for naps. So sugar slows right down every single time the temperature drops, and the tortoise trundles on regardless. So in a cool place, the sugar reaches its Goldilocks level at roughly the same moment that the skins, seeds, and stems stop tasting like green banana. So sugar and phenolics, the tortoise and the hare, cross the finish line holding hands, mostly. And that raises an obvious question. Where in South Africa could we possibly find a climate that acts like that? Well, I am so glad that you asked. In 2002, a Belgian couple called Joris and Natalie van Almenkerk moved to South Africa to plant a vineyard. And they arrived with just a minor setback when compared, say, to all the other generations of farmers who had lived in that valley all along. They had no centuries of amassed generational farming wisdom, no great-great-grandfather whispering about which slopes to plant. Everything the neighbors knew in their bones, this family had to work out from scratch. So Joris, who is an almost alarmingly scientifically minded man, substituted diligence in for dynasty. Soil studies, solar mapping, climate reports. Before a single vine went into the ground, this farm had been measured to within an inch of its life, if you can, in fact, kill something by measuring it. And the place that he chose to do all of this was Elgin, which, if you have watched this channel for any period of time, you may remember holds a particular title. It is the outright cold unit champion of all the South African wine regions. And something else worth knowing, although we call Elgin a valley, Elgin is really a bowl sitting on top of a mountain. It's remarkably high up, with some of the vineyards close to 700 meters above sea level, which catches people out because you drive from the Helderberg, or the southern end of Stellenbosch, and you realize that you actually have a serious mountain pass to get over to get into this so-called valley. Now, of course, Joris was also acutely aware, as the best Elgin producers tend to be, of what this bowl shape actually does, because Elgin sits just in from the cool Cape South coast, so it acts as a natural stopping point for these banks of clouds that roll in off the ocean and up the escarpment. And those cloud banks do exactly what cloud banks are supposed to do. They filter out harsh solar radiation and they keep the entire valley really quite cool. So Merlot in Elgin was not just a romantic hunch. It was a data-driven conclusion reached roughly 20 years before a panel of international judges would stand up in Cape Town and announce that Merlot is a cool climate grape in a hot world. Now, before we taste it, I can hear the objections forming. Fine, Han, but the judges didn't single out Elgin. They just said South African Merlot is a hot mess, case closed. And to that I say fair dues. For most South African Merlot, they are completely right. Here's the thing though. South Africa has about 4,900 hectares of Merlot. Stellenbosch and Paarl between them hold nearly half of it. And then the Swartland and the Breedekloof and Robertson and Worcester, almost all of them are warm. In fact, forget warm, some of them are properly hot. And then there is the cool South Coast, which includes Elgin and Walker Bay, the places where this grape actually wants to live, and yet these two regions hold a meager 100 hectares. That's just 2%, which means that, in agreement with the Trophy Wine Show judges, 98% of South Africa's Merlot is planted where Merlot is miserable. So today we're going to cheerfully ignore that 98% and we're going to go and look at the 2% that seems to know something that the rest of the world has forgotten, which is that Pomerol is not the only place where Merlot can taste great and age like Clooney. And I know this because I drank today's curious wine from 2023 alongside alongside the exact same wine from 2014. So let's start with the present, the 2023 bottling, and give it a sniff. Well, on the nose, we actually get a lovely hint of cocoa dusting and then some darker fruit. Often in South Africa, especially when you drink cheaper Merlots, it gets described as a medium light-bodied red fruited wine. But here we get black currant, we've got a little bit of black cherry, kind of maraschino, but then there is little touches of sour red cherry and perhaps even raspberry kind of riding shotgun along with those. Then let's get into the glass and give it a sip. Well, the palate is medium weighted, perhaps as you might expect from South African Merlot, but the fruit is just so clean and the tannins have just enough grip to be taken seriously. And there's this fresh acid holding the whole thing upright. It's beautifully engaging. Then there is also a little touch of herbal leafiness, and hold that thought because we're going to come back to it and it matters more than you'd expect. Then on the finish of the wine, there's this lovely mix of candied red cherry and then it goes savory. There's almost cherry skin tomato, a sort of piquant, snappy little thing. And I love a red wine that can carry fruit and still end savory. But here's what this wine does that you really need to know about. It doesn't hand you everything on the first sniff. So I've spent a couple of days with this particular wine and straight after the pour, it's pleasant and it's tidy, but it is slightly reserved. And then if you give it 15 minutes, it kind of starts to unpack its luggage as it feels more at home. And so then you start getting a lovely lift of sort of fresh thyme, maybe even oregano, and then I think that tips over into a sweeter lavender. And I'm not talking about your grand soap drawer. I mean the fresh sprig, delicate, articulate floral lavender. And then the black currant, which starts out politely at the back, moves in and settles in deeper. So this is not a wine that explodes, it's a wine that emerges, and those aromas are not an accident. So thyme and lavender are actually botanical next door neighbors, herbs of scrubby, wind-blown, cool places. And the perfume rides on exactly the kind of delicate aromatic compounds that over ripeness burns off first. So if you pick late in a hot region and that lavender sprig has evaporated long before the grape ever gets close to the crusher. So only slow ripening will leave those beautiful sort of elements standing. Now that sprig of lavender in the glass is quite literally the tortoise winning the race. Now I mentioned earlier that kind of green leaf, thyme, mint sometimes, even lavender leaves, not necessarily the florals. And I asked you to hold on to it. And that's because at this year's Trophy Wine Show feedback, one of the judges, was coming from the UK, said that international palates now actively want a herbal lift on Bordeaux varieties, which is wild because there was a time when any hint of greenness, whether it was capsicum or leafiness or eucalyptus or any of those green herbal and vegetal notes, was deemed an absolute flaw. But because we're in an area of climate change, fruit with no herbal edge, and I quote, presents as dead. So the world now wants that herbal lift back, not because herbal lifts have changed, but because they imply some sort of overcoming of the dangers presented by climate change. So the thyme, the lavender, the leaf, those are not flaws to apologize for. That is the accent of the address of Elgin Valley. Right, now let's hop into our time machine and taste the 2014. And first of all, it's really interesting just to see the color next to one another. 2014 definitely having matured, but still having beautiful concentration and purity of color. So from a vintage perspective, 2014, South Africa wrote it off because it was cold and wet and miserable. So let's see what that shows like on the nose. Well, it is immediately more savory, and that is what you'd expect from a little bit of tertiary. So this savory bay leaf and a hint of smoked game meat, and that's what a decade of wine does to a good red wine. It quietly trades fruit for umami. And then there's also lovely aromas of dried leaves, little touch of smoke. But that's not to say the fruit has died. It hasn't. There's still fruit there. There's prune, and where fresh cherry used to be, there's some slightly dried currants. And then still sitting right in the middle of it all is this lovely maraschino cherry that I mentioned. So let's give it a sip and see what it's like on the palate. Ooh, well, when people tell you that wines need tannins to age, you just need to drink something like the Almenkerk Merlot and see that this was never a big wine and is not a big wine. It's supremely light stepping, elegant. The tannins have, after 12 years, completely integrated. And 12 years on, it still stays fresh and actually keeps getting longer the more time it spends in the glass. It definitely does linger. And I'd say the 2014 actually lingers considerably longer than the 2023. But I guess if you want this whole argument compressed into one little image, here it is. This wine is Bill Nye in a bottle. It's quiet, dry, beautifully articulated, never raises its voice, but improves with age at a rate that is frankly a bit rude to the rest of us. So now if we look at the labels, the 2014 is 13.5%. The 2023 is 13.5%. That's 9 vintages apart, exactly the same alcohol and the same character run through the two wines. So while much of the country of South Africa was chasing 15% icon wines back in that day, this cold Apple Valley was quietly turning out Merlot at a right bank Bordeaux level, twice a decade apart. Now, if you do that once at 13.5 paps, that's a good vintage. But if you do it twice, 9 years apart, that is the sight of Almenkerk and of Elgin speaking. And another thing that the judges said was that Merlot has a habit of getting to 16% alcohol and the tannins are still not right. Well, I would suggest Almenkerk doesn't need to issue a rebuttal. They just need to courier out a few sets of reading glasses and copies of their wine labels. And your free tip of the day, don't judge a cool climate red on the first pour. Open it before you start making dinner, not as you're plating it. Wines from slow places open slowly. It's an essential part of the vibe. So how do we square this circle? Because 25 Merlots walk into a competition and get judged by arguably a really, really qualified panel of judges. I think one of the best panels in the entire country. But it gets described, this class, as bitter and tannic. And notably, they get described that way by a panel that is not just South African, but includes masters of wine from around the world and absolute legends like Oz Clarke. So here is my theory on what's going on. When Merlot is bad, it shouts. It's bitter, it's over-oaked, it's got that weird Bovril thing going on, it's hot. But when Merlot is great, it behaves the way that many old vine wines are famous for behaving. Reserved, a little suspicious of strangers. It doesn't explode, it whispers. Now, you put that into the context of a blind tasting where a judge has 25 glasses, roughly 2 minutes per wine, and some of those layers only arrive in the 15th minute. So the format is structurally rigged against patience, which is not remotely the same thing as being rigged against quality. And I think that that is Merlot's real tragedy. It's a quiet grape that keeps getting cast in loud roles. Now, there is a man in Bordeaux called Edouard Mouilleux, and his family farms Pomerol, which is the one place on earth that even the Trophy Wine Show admitted still gets Merlot right. And he once said that everyone calls Pinot Noir the heartbreak grape, but they do not know Merlot. Merlot is the heartbreak grape, which might well be true, but I would put it slightly different. The heartbreak is not the grape. The heartbreak is the address. And if you'd really like to have your noodle baked, quote the oracle, try applying this exact theory to Pinotage, which is another fast ripening red grape. And then ask yourself whether Elgin and Walker Bay might quietly be hiding some insane cool climate Pinotages that you have simply never tried because everyone told you that those regions were only for hunting Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. So tell me in the comments, have you tasted a cool climate South African Merlot that changed your mind, or are you team judges and we should just pull the damn thing out? I do read everything and I promise to reply. And I also promised you links. So I'm going to leave you links right here, which will take you deeper down the rabbit hole. The first video link is the fuller Almenkerk story and their gloriously geeky Chardonnay and why Elgin is officially the coldest region in South Africa. And the second is a Merlot growing high up on the Simonsberg, which is indeed in Stellenbosch, but it makes very much the same argument from a completely different address. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the HANtv Solo YouTube channel, then do so now because we have more than 500 videos just like this one. And until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.